Good afternoon and welcome. We're so grateful you could join us for today's webinar on centering anti-racist approaches in conversations with McKinney Vento families and colleagues. My name is Erin Patterson. I'm the Director of Education Initiatives at SchoolHouse Connection, and I will be facilitating our discussion today. Before we get started, I just wanted to share a few housekeeping reminders. We are on GoToWebinar, and this conversation is for you. And so we encourage you to use the questions pane to enter any questions that you have at any point throughout today's conversation, and I will do my best to moderate those and share those with our presenters. You'll also receive a recording of this webinar along with the slides that we're sharing today, including links to the resources we'll be discussing, and you'll automatically receive that email after the webinar. If you are new to SchoolHouse Connection, welcome. We're so glad you've joined us today for this conversation. I want to share just a little bit of information about who we are. We are a national nonprofit advocacy organization committed to overcoming homelessness through education. And we do this in several ways. We engage in advocacy at the federal and state policy levels. We also offer practical assistance to our contacts throughout state McKinney Vento coordinators, LEA liaisons, and community partners. And we also support a network of young scholars who are higher ed students who have experienced homelessness themselves. You can see links to some of our resources there. We encourage you to visit our website, schoolhouseconnection.org. We try and keep our resources up to date, including some frequently asked questions, which have been really useful and popular during COVID-19 in particular, and updates on federal policy as well. I am so thrilled to be joined today by our colleagues at NYS Teaches, Jennifer Pringle, who is project director, and Anasofia Trelles, who is their education specialist. And they have created this wonderful resource on centering anti-racist approaches and conversations with McKinney Vento families and colleagues, and have graciously agreed to join me today for a conversation. And so I'll offer in just a minute just a few data points to get us started and to anchor our conversation. And then I'll invite them in to present about this resource and share some of the context around it. And then I'll ask them a few questions before opening it up to you all for your questions. So again, we encourage you to use that questions pane as you're listening and share any questions that you have for our presenters today. I wanted to start by offering the latest data from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. The YRBS is administered every other year by the Centers for Disease Control, and the 2019 data is the most recent data set that we have. And it includes information that 27 states asked, including several questions about homelessness, particularly how high school students experience homelessness. And so you can see here, unfortunately, the takeaway is that students of color are overrepresented among students experiencing homelessness. And just for example, Black students make up 20.3% of high school students experiencing homelessness, but they comprise only 13% of all high school students. Similarly, Hispanic Latino students make up 35.9% of students experiencing homelessness, but comprise only 25% of all students experiencing homelessness, high school students experiencing homelessness. And lastly, American Indian and Alaska Native students make up 1.6% of students experiencing homelessness, but only 1.4% of all high school students. This is a great data set that we have at the national level to be able to see across. There are a number of states who also collect and disaggregate this data on students experiencing homelessness by race. And these are just a few examples that we've included, but we encourage you to go find your state's data dashboard or whatever data source they might have on students experiencing homelessness and see how they disaggregate that data by race and ethnicity. For today's conversation, Schoolhouse wanted not only to present and acknowledge these racial disparities, but start to open up a conversation about now what? What can we do? And what are some tools, resources, and strategies that might be effective in not only acknowledging these disparities, but working to overcome them? And so with that, I'd like to pause here for just a moment, and I'm going to check our questions pane to see if there are any questions about the data that we've shared. And if not, again, you can find this data on our website. We're continually updating each of the sections of the YRBS data summaries, including identification, race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation and gender identity. And so we encourage you to check back there for updates. With that, I'd like to invite Jen Pringle and Anasofia Trelles to join me, and I will hand over the presentation gavel to you all.
Thank you, Erin, for that nice introduction. I'm pleased to be able to share this guide with its primary author, my astounding colleague, Anasofia Trelles. Before we jump into the guide and its development, we wanted to share a little bit about who we are. For those of you who may not be familiar with New York State Teaches, we are a technical assistance center focused on homeless education issues. We're funded by our state education department to largely fulfill many of the McKinney Vento state coordinator functions. So we do trainings for school districts. We maintain the list of liaisons. We develop resources to help liaisons do their work. We also support the districts that receive McKinney Vento grants. We have an info line where school district staff, parents, social service providers, and others can call with questions related to the education of children and youth experiencing homelessness. And then we help school districts if they have broader questions about how they can best support the education of children and youth experiencing homelessness. And for several years now, we've tried to incorporate into our training materials explicit mention of race, and in particular, the disproportionate impact that homelessness has on Black and Brown families in New York State. For example, in New York City, the family shelter system is made up 95% of families who identify as Black and Hispanic. And we draw attention to this because we want to show how systems of oppression replicate themselves in what we see in our work in the education system, but also in the housing system and health system and the criminal justice system. I also want to just take a step back about myself. I am a middle-aged white woman, and I was taught growing up never to mention race. I always remember the example of if you, when describing someone, I would go out of my way not to identify their race. So it was the woman wearing the jeans and the red shirt and no mention of race, even though, of course, I noticed it. And of course, the people I was talking to recognized race, but I was taught that you should not mention race, that you should be colorblind. And through the years, I've noticed, I've learned how destructive and corrosive that is, and that we must speak about race. We must speak about white supremacy and the impact of racism on our systems. I'm not trying to pretend that McKinney Vento can answer all of these things. It is not designed to, but unless we address this head on, unless we mention this explicitly, McKinney Vento and our work in advancing educational opportunities and success for children and youth experiencing homelessness, it will be hampered because racism definitely plays a role. So one, I'm excited to share with you, we're excited to share with you this communications guide. As I mentioned, my colleague Anasofia was the lead author of this document, and she is going to talk a little bit about its development. Anasofia.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that really sweet introduction. So yes, I work primarily on our info line. So I talk to McKinney Vento liaisons and other school staff pretty much on a daily basis. And so the communications guide really came out of real interactions and conversations that InfoLine has had with McKinney Vento liaisons. And so we really wanted to create a resource that felt reflective but also actionable. And so the communications guide really addresses some of the intersections between systemic racism, homelessness, and kind of where McKinney Vento liaisons play a role in all of this. But we also, recognize that anti-racist work is a really big topic, and so we really wanted to create something that felt like there are actionable steps. There are small changes that McKinney Vento liaisons can do to really kind of develop a strong relationship and supportive relationship with students and families, particularly Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And the other thing that I think is particularly interesting about this guide and really helpful is that it does touch on some larger issues. So there are sections in there that address school segregation, over policing, which are direct results of anti-racist policies, systemically racist policies. And so this is kind of an entry point, right? Like, we don't expect McKinney Vento liaisons to know everything that there is to know about systemic racism, but this is a guide that they can go back to. It's actionable, and then also, offers an entry point to other articles and resources where they can learn more and be fully informed about systemic racism as a whole. I don't know if there was any questions, Erin, that you wanted to address, or anything in the chat pod that's coming in.
Awesome. Thank you both. That's such a great introduction and overview to not only the guide, but to NYS Teaches as well. And we have just a few questions that I want to pose to you all, and we'll just get a little conversation going here, if that's okay. And I'll keep monitoring our questions pane and be sure to make sure that you all hear those as well. And just, I'm seeing, will the resource be shared? Absolutely. I can drop that in the chat box in just a moment, and it'll also be hyperlinked in the slides, which you'll get a copy of after the presentation. So thanks for asking that. First, I'm wondering, Anasofia, maybe we'll go to you first for this. What kind of reaction or feedback have you received since you published and released this communications guide?
Yeah, so the guide is fairly new, so we're definitely, hearing more feedback as folks have more bandwidth to sit with this kind of resource. But the one thing that we're really excited about is that we are actually going to be facilitating a call in a few weeks with McKinney Vento liaisons across New York State who are really interested in furthering, anti-racist practices within their work and their school districts. And I really think like this conversation would not have come about had we not taken the first step and published this guide. So some good things and probably some better things to come. So we'll see.
That's great to hear. And I'm wondering, what do you hope will result from the development of this?
Yeah, I would love to say that, we want McKinney Vento liaisons to read this and become anti-racist, but that's not a realistic goal. I think that, we at New York State Teachers really believe that anti-racist work is ongoing, and like, unfortunately, a communications guide is not the end all be all. But like I mentioned, I think that we really hope that this communications guide just allows a little bit of reflection for McKinney Vento liaisons. So if, they haven't really had the chance to think about, systemic racism, homelessness, and kind of like where they fit in all of this, it really allows them to start doing some of that work in a way that I think, again, doesn't feel overwhelming, right? It doesn't feel like I have to solve every issue related to systemic racism, but I can do these real things and emphasize these points in my conversations with families. And I think just ultimately we just want to raise awareness. I think that, oftentimes we have conversations about homelessness, but we're not addressing race and the need to incorporate anti-racist practices. So hopefully this will, fuel some more conversations around that.
That's really great to hear. One big question that's been on my mind is, how do you approach conversations with liaisons or others who might not see the need for a guide like this?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a tough question, and something that we've thought about a lot at New York State Teaches. The one thing that I think is important to remind folks is that words really do matter, and sometimes who says them matters even more. And so like in New York State specifically, we know that the majority of our liaisons are white folks, but we know that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are disproportionately experiencing homelessness. And so I think as a McKinney Vento liaison, you can't really take a colorblind approach to this work. Similar to what Jennifer was saying, we know that families of particular identities are experiencing this, and so in order to make the best eligibility determinations, in order to really treat families with the utmost respect and empathy, liaisons really should be informed about systemic racism and how that perpetuates homelessness for these folks.
All great thoughts. Thank you so much. I also want to ask you, how can you help a colleague see that what might be perceived as just insensitivity is actually racist and has significant impacts on students and families of color?
Yeah. I mean, I think going back to kind of what we were talking about words mattering, and the thing that I think is also really important is that like intent and impact are really not the same thing. And so I think oftentimes as a white person, it can be really tempting to say like, well, I didn't mean that to sound that way, or I didn't mean to be racist or discriminatory. But like, if you are the Black, Indigenous, and person of color receiving that comment, like you can't just shake off the damaging impacts of that comment. Like it's going to sit with you. You're going to have to deal with it. And so I think with McKinney Vento liaisons particularly, like you may be the first person that a family experiencing homelessness comes in contact with in the district. And if that family or that student is a person of color, like it can be super disheartening to find out that the person that's supposed to help you and give you supports like may not be super supportive, may have some problematic beliefs. And again, like the way that you're communicating with that family can signal that without you even saying it. And so I think like it's important to recognize that like those negative interactions have such big impacts on families. Like that can signal to a family, I can't trust the liaison, I can't trust the school, or maybe I just can't trust the education system at large. And that's such a huge missed opportunity, considering that we know that students experiencing homelessness, succeed in school when they have trusting relationships in school. So it's really been it's more than just about a comment.
That's a lot to think about. Thank you for that. That T word, trust, is so important, as we've learned, especially when we're talking about systemic racism. I'm curious, you earlier alluded to the fact that we don't have exact data on this, but we can probably guess that many of our LEA McKinney Vento liaisons and state coordinators are white, while we've seen the data on the overrepresentation of students of color who experience homelessness. I'm wondering, from a different perspective, what about a McKinney Vento liaison of color who might be having an issue working with their white colleagues and trying to help them see this as an issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that, and I will say as a person of color myself, is something that I've navigated through in my own career. And I don't know that I have a great answer, but what I will say is that I think it's very circumstantial. I know for me, there have been situations where I feel safe and supported, and I feel like I can call out, a colleague who may have said something that didn't land right, or, was problematic in some way. And there are also circumstances where I need to self-preserve, right? Like my identity is wrapped up in this comment or this issue. And sometimes I need to take a step back and process what I'm feeling and then decide what that next step is, whether it's, okay, I'm ready to confront this person, or it's I'm ready to lean into my support systems. And I know, Jen will probably touch on this a little more, but at New York State Teaches, I've always felt like there are people that I can turn to support me in this issue. And I think that needs to be built in every aspect of our work, and particularly in school buildings.
And just if I can build off of what Anasofia was just sharing about a bit, I think what I have seen is white people taking a step back, like, well, I can't talk about that because that's a diversity issue. And no, we're all part of this here. Like, and if we really want to dismantle white supremacy, white people have to be a part of that solution. And so to expect that, if there is an issue, with regard to between a family and a staff person, that it's only the BIPOC staff who have to address that. I mean, that is deeply problematic, and we as allies need to step up and start calling each other out as well. I mean, I think there's some articles out there about calling in versus calling out, and that's also something to think about, certainly in a school district when you're talking about who has power in a conversation. So being aware of what those power positions are and where you are in that, and your ability to call someone in to have a conversation versus when it's appropriate to call someone out, and what you're signaling to not only the family, but also to your other staff as well, about what is appropriate and what isn't. And also, I think, listen, I have a lot of learning to do myself. I don't pretend to have all the answers. I think at least I aspire to approach this work with humility, and with a sense that I am still learning, um, and also that I know that I can't rely on others to give me the answer as well, that I need to be doing my own research. So to think like, oh, can you just explain to me why that's problematic, why that's racist? Like, no, that's what Google's for. You need to do some research yourself. You need to do so, and if you still have questions, that's okay, but show that that you yourself are curious about learning more. At least that's what I'm trying to do, is understand where I still need to learn and grow, and that I play an integral part in terms of my own office, in terms of our project New York State Teaches. How can we learn and grow? How can we create an atmosphere where we can identify, hey, that didn't land right. Let's talk about that. Let's delve a little bit deeper. And in terms of work with McKinney Vento liaisons, we certainly hear things from school district administrators, things like, I have a fiduciary responsibility to the taxpayers of this district, so I have to ask these questions, or I have to explore this. And just like unpacking that with folks a little bit, like, well, what do you mean by who are the taxpayers that you have this responsibility to? Who does that include? Who does that exclude? And how do you put that into a broader context of access to housing in your community? So just delving a little bit deeper, because oftentimes, I mean, fortunately, most of the statements that or conversations that we have with folks aren't overtly racist. It's the subtle racism. It's the coded language that we all like. They're not. I just knew they were not from here. Well, what do you mean by that? Or we have to make sure that we do a background check just to make sure that there aren't any outstanding suspensions. Like, what would make you think that this student had been suspended before? So, and I also think that one thing that's very important is practicing this. These are tough conversations. I want to say, for one, I really struggle with it. I really, really struggle with it. It is hard, but I think having the language, being comfortable or more comfortable with the language in questioning, is important, because when you're, I mean, I'm sure we've all had those situations where, oh, I wish I could have said that. Oh, if I could just go back and I would have said this, this, and this. And so, but if we practice, well, what were you thinking when you said that? Or, why did you think that the family wasn't living here? If you're ready with some questions, then you're more likely to use them in the moment.
That is a lot of great information and thoughts to process. We do have many questions and comments coming into our questions pane, and I just want to start with two in particular that I feel are really important to elevate right now. And they're both from McKinney Vento liaisons who identify as people of color, and I feel it's important to share out loud and acknowledge what they are sharing. The first comment says, as a POC McKinney Vento liaison, it is super difficult for me to call out or call in people that are in positions of power when they exhibit racist or racist-like behaviors. How do I find allies that are not POC that will be willing to start these conversations? And I felt it was important to say that out loud because one starting answer to that question is having conversations like this. And Jen, I appreciated your point earlier when you introduced this conversation by saying you are entering this space as a white woman, and it is really important to acknowledge that. And so I really wanted to give some time and some acknowledgement to these particular comments that are coming in, that it is our responsibility as white people in this space to have and to force those conversations so that people of color don't feel that burden and that challenge, particularly when you're trying to bring it up with someone who has power over you already. I want to pause there and see if either of you have any thoughts about that particular comment. Oh, Jen, I think you're on mute.
No webinar would be complete without saying that. Sorry about that. I would, you know, I don't work in a school district, and I just, you know, it is so critical for white folks who consider themselves allies to put themselves out there, to make sure it is known to their colleagues who are people of color, that they are their allies. I mean, that's, I think it's on us to say we're here to support you, you know, so that, you know, it's not always falling on BIPOC staff to say, you know what, and this is what they said yet again.
I think the other thing too that I would point to is let the guide work for you. Like, I know that we at New York State teachers will often tell McKinney Vento liaisons, like, share this resource, like, with anybody, like, share it on an email, do whatever. And I think as a person of color, it might be scary to start these conversations on your own, but I think sharing this resource, and depending on who gives you some feedback, just like kind of what we've done, where we're sending this out to liaisons and seeing like who wants to engage in this work, might be a good way to, you know, try and find some allies that are not also people of color, which is, I will say, very difficult sometimes. So I totally recognize that fear.
That's such a great point. Thank you both. Similarly, I want to elevate this comment that we received. As an advocate of color, I do not always feel comfortable being the person who speaks out against issues regarding race. I will do it for my students, but I have received a lot of pushback and dismissal of my concerns. It is a daily struggle, especially when I'm the only professional employee of color in my building. And there again, I think it's important just to sit with these realities of our liaisons and advocates of color as they navigate this world, this racist system. And I'm hoping that by elevating it on this platform, that it's another signal for all of us to be aware, but in particular, our white colleagues. I do want to address some of the other questions that have come in. We've had a few questions about how can folks present this to their districts or educators in their district? What might be a good way to go about that?
Do you want to take it first, Anasofia? Or I'm happy to.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think McKinney Vento liaisons are required to, you know, educate other staff members about the rights of students experiencing homelessness. And so we've done a little bit of this in our work as well, where like there is room to do a McKinney Vento one-on-one and then include a slide about, but also let's look at some stats, or also let's look at this guide. Like, it's not always the McKinney Vento 101. Like, this is also a part of knowing, you know, what's happening with our students on the ground. So Definitely including our slides, or not our slides, but just like including this resource or making your own slide about statistics from SchoolHouse Connection's website, like anything like that, I think is a good entry point.
Jen, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, exactly what Anasofia said.
I'll also add that we've been hearing from more and more districts across the country who are acknowledging that there is a racial inequity problem and are doing things like telling some of their teams and departments to develop racial equity plans for McKinney Vento students, et cetera. And so that is one leverage point and opportunity to start to elevate this resource and the conversation. And relatedly, to this point, one of the comments we received is that too many white colleagues do not see the connection between racism and bias as trauma, and that many districts are speaking of trauma, but many staff do not make that connection. And I think that is such an important point. And what I love about your guide is how you centered the perspective of a student or family member of color and how our words can be perceived. To your point, Anasofia, earlier, whether it's implicit or explicit, the impact is still real for our students and families of color and traumatic. And so I'll toss that out there and see if you have any reactions to that connection between trauma and racism.
Yeah, I mean, I think something that we really wanted to get at with the guide is that I don't know that any McKinney Vento liaison that we work with would I say I have a racist belief. Like I think they would just see themselves as somebody who's just following protocol, who's just doing what they need to do. But I think we have to take a step back and remember that like some of these policies and protocols are rooted in systemic racism. And so like, what does it mean to be a McKinney Vento liaison where you do have the ability to revise policies for families and students experiencing homelessness, and you have a say in who gets access to education? I think both of those things have to happen. Like you need to understand that some of these policies and these procedures may be inherently perpetuating racism. And so I think that's super important to consider.
Yeah, that's great. I'm scrolling through all these wonderful questions, and there was one that I wanted to be sure and elevate. It says, can we consider incorporating a targeted focus on cultivating anti-racist approaches into our statewide registration or McKinney Vento liaison training? And I know we talked about a few examples of how districts could present this guide, but I'm wondering if either of you has any thoughts on how to actually incorporate this into some formal training. And Jen, I don't know if you have some first thoughts on that.
Yes, I think one thing I would say is, you know, you are welcome and encouraged, and I wouldn't get in the way of doing a training specifically on anti-racist practices, but please don't start and end there. Like all of your McKinney Vento trainings should be including something about the impact of racism on homeless education, the incidence of homelessness, the educational outcomes of students. It should be woven in there. So what does that look like? So for if you're doing something about identification, you know, McKinney Vento, an introduction to McKinney Vento and identification, and you're looking at the causes of homelessness in your community, you could include a slide in there about redlining in your community, in your state, and the impact of that and what that looks like now. I'm not saying, you know, you need to do a PhD on this, but you can go to the internet, and these maps are widely available that you can look up. Lots of folks are doing training, are including information like this in their training. So you include something about the impact of redlining on access to housing, home ownership, generational wealth, and again, it doesn't need to be a long discussion about it, but you start including mention of it. And, you know, it's not surprising that we see the results that we have today. The system is working well. Like people oftentimes that say that the system is broken, and no, the system is not broken. The system is designed to function this way. And it's not surprising that we get the outcomes that we do, given the system, the white supremacist systems in play. So again, a couple slides, just a little bit of background, and if possible, if you can find something local. If you're talking about a statewide training, you know, if you can find a couple communities in your state that you can highlight. About again, redlining, access to housing, that can set the stage for a conversation about racism and McKinney Vento. And the reason why I say, like, you know, you can do a training about anti-racist practices, and that's great. But if you really, really want to make change, it has to be repeated conversations in your work, not just the one-off, because then people check the box, you know, oh, I did my anti-racist training, I did my anti-bias training, and you can move on. But to really delve deeply, you need to come back to it. So in thinking about trainings, I would say, build it into whatever cycle of trainings you have being offered, and maybe it's just a couple slides in each of those that are building on each other.
That's great, thank you. I want to acknowledge a couple comments that we've received about the people are in the moment as we speak trying to print out the resource on the slide and letting us know that it's too small. And yes, it is too small. We will be sure that you all receive the link to the NYS Teaches webpage where this resource lives, and you can also download it as a PDF document and read it in all of its big font glory. So that will be sent to you after the webinar today. I want to raise this question that I really appreciate. How can I help change the culture when I work in a district and area that is rural and almost all the students and staff are white? My students so rarely interact with people of color, and I want to help make sure they don't become or stay racist, but I'm not sure how.
I don't pretend to have the answer about that. I am not I am not in a I do not live in a rural community, and I am not an educator in the classroom. But I do want to say that the issue of systemic racism impacts all school districts everywhere. You may not see it in your immediate school building in terms of racial diversity, but you're certainly seeing it in the media. You're certainly seeing it on TV. You are reading, you're hearing about it. So I guess what I would say, and there are tons of resources about this online, and I encourage you to go check it out. And I can follow up with Erin for some resources to include afterwards. But I just strongly encourage everyone to think about this as it is all of our communities that are impacted by this, and we need to talk about it in that way, and saying it's not in our community because we're rural, we're almost exclusively white, so we don't really have to talk about it. As the commenter suggested, that inhibits young people from developing the facility, the vocabulary, the awareness, the knowledge to address these issues going forward, and it's doing them a disservice. But I will follow up with Erin with some links afterwards.
Thanks for that, Jen. And Anasofia, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Sorry.
You're good. I'm gonna pose another question while Anasofia works it out. So I saw a question come through, a couple questions actually, noting just sort of the tension between the fact that this is obviously super important for liaisons, not just to acknowledge, but to work to overcome these racial disparities and racial inequities. In addition to that, It is very rare that an LEA liaison is a full-time paid position. They are wearing multiple hats, and the stress of all of the responsibilities sometimes causes a liaison to feel like they don't have enough time to dedicate to different buckets of work. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on how liaisons and how districts can help support liaisons to manage and to balance all of these important things.
I'm sorry, my mute button got stuck.
You're good.
I can address that, but I think something that we have talked a lot about, especially in the context of the pandemic, is that McKinney Vento liaisons really can't do it all. Like we know that, and I think like we talked about, allyship is important, figuring out who can support you. SchoolHouse Connections, I think, has a phenomenal resource about like checking how you can fill your roles, all your responsibilities as a McKinney Vento liaison. I think looking through that and maybe adding a section to think about like, who can I turn to help me with this work? And I think outside of that, like what I was going to say earlier was that like, I think sometimes with anti-racist work, there's this fear of like, I have to get it perfect, or like, I can't do it at all. And like, the truth of the matter is that like, as a person of color, like I'm happy to just see a white person try. Like I'm just happy with that. And I think families and students would probably feel similarly. Like you're not going to get it perfect the first time. You might get some feedback that you don't like, but just taking that first step has some benefits. Just like we just went ahead and did this guide without really knowing where it was going to go and how it was going to be received. So.
That's great. Thank you, Anasofia. Jen, I'm not trying to bulldoze over you, but in the interest of time, I want to try and get at least 2 more questions in, and we have so many questions and comments for you all. This one, I thought it was important to elevate. Which McKinney Vento student demographic breakdown data within an LEA do you consider most important to display on a division website dashboard? And what type or types of data could present a risk for implicit biases or community profiling?
Oh, that's such a good question. That's such a good question. I have feelings about this. I really think it depends where the discussion is at in your district about systemic racism. Because there are a lot of folks who look at educational outcomes of Black and Brown students, and their takeaway is Black and Brown students are dumb. I mean, it is infuriating. So unless there's a discussion about the causes, the things contributing to that, you know, I think, you know, disproportionality is very important to highlight. But are we tying it to housing segregation? Are we tying it to school resources? Are we tying it to teacher training available? Are we tying? So I think it's just very complex, and oftentimes with you know, these dashboards, you know, you get this quick snapshot, but how is that contextualized? And where is it directing people for additional information? Like if you want to learn more about this, who are they being pointed to? What additional sources are they being pointed to? So yeah, I think context matters greatly.
Anasofia, anything to add on that data question?
No, I think we're all set.
Okay. There was one other question that I'm going to try and paraphrase here in the interest of time, but because we scheduled this webinar for 45 minutes and we want to be respectful of people's time. I wanted to raise a question from someone in New Mexico who made the point that many families and communities are made up of Native folks and families, and particularly the Navajo Nation, and they might not identify as homeless themselves, even though they meet the criteria set out in McKinney Vento. And so the question around how can you address some of those cultural conversations? And I will use this opportunity to plug that our next webinar in this series will be April 26th, and it's going to be with some folks in Montana who will share their strategies for working with Native students experiencing homelessness. But I want to pose that to you all to see if you have any thoughts on that.
We got a very similar question related to particularly to families, particularly immigrant families living in overcrowded housing situations where where the family does not consider themselves temporarily housed or homeless or McKinney Vento eligible. And I think a lot of that conversation has to do with trust between whoever's having that conversation from the school and the family. And it can't just be about McKinney Vento identification. Why are you asking me these questions? Why is this information important? If my child is identified this way, what's going to happen? I mean, there's just a label of homeless is so loaded for many families. And then if you're talking about a cross-cultural conversation where you're talking about someone from outside of the community coming in and asking some pretty intrusive questions and on the face of it, passing pretty negative judgments about the housing situation, you know, that's very threatening. So I just think trust is so critical. And again, that having that context of why are we asking these questions? What are the benefits to the student for McKinney Vento eligibility? This is not about passing judgment about the parenting going on. This is talking about access to services, and families in certain types of housing situations can get access to additional services in this way.
Anasofia, any last words?
No, I just second what Jen said. I think even in my own work talking to families, just acknowledging this is not a judgment call, but more like, how can I get you more services, is usually a really good, you know, tip for that situation.
Jennifer Pringle, Anasofia Trelles, NYS Teaches, their new resource on centering anti-racist approaches and conversations with McKinney Vento families and colleagues is in these slides. We will make sure it's hyperlinked and that you receive that hyperlink as soon as this presentation ends. Again, just a reminder that we will be continuing these conversations, particularly on racial equity and students experiencing homelessness. Our next one will be April 26th at 2 p.m. and we'll be joined by some of our friends in Montana who will share their strategies for serving Native students experiencing homelessness. And we have some other great, rich conversations lined up. You all, thank you so much for kicking off this series with such rich information and conversation. And thank you for being willing to be vulnerable and to share your thoughts. And thank our audience. Thank you so much for your attentiveness and participation today. And don't hesitate to reach out. Our emails are there on the slide. I hope everyone has a wonderful Thursday.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, you all.
Thank you.